I've always found this case deeply unsettling. It's one of those stories that stays with you. Let me tell you what happened. The alarm clock didn't ring. But Gregor Samsa was awake. He lay on his back, and his eyes took a moment to adjust, not to the light, but to the curve of his own body. That's when he saw it. A dome of brown shell, hard and curved like armor, rising where his chest should have been. He blinked. The shell didn't blink back. He tried to sit up, and instead of his hands pushing against the mattress, he felt a dozen thin, pitiful legs waving in the air, like the legs of a drowned spider. They were his legs now. And he couldn't control them. You'd think he'd scream. But the first sound he made wasn't a scream. It was a dry, clicking noise from his throat, like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been used in years. And then, silence. Because the quietest moments are always the most terrifying. You don't scream when you realize you've stopped being human. You just stop breathing. Gregor Samsa was a traveling salesman. He woke at dawn, every day, in a small, cluttered bedroom in his family's apartment in Prague. The room smelled of dust and old wood and the faint, metallic tang of rain from the window he always kept cracked. You could hear the clatter of horse-drawn carts on the cobblestones below. You could smell the coffee from the cafe 2 streets over, bitter and cheap. This was the world Gregor knew. A world of ledgers and train schedules and the constant, grinding pressure of debt. His father's debt. A debt that Gregor, and only Gregor, could pay off. So every morning, he'd push back the heavy quilt, feel the cold floorboards under his feet, and remind himself that he was a good son. That he was doing this for them. But on this morning, there was no quilt. There was no floor. There was only the hard, convex shell of his back, and the frantic, useless twitching of those insect legs. And the first question that rises in your throat isn't how, but why now? Why, after 5 years of this grinding routine, did the world decide to break him open? He tried to speak. He called out for his mother. But the voice that came out was a low, animal whine, a sound like a rusty hinge, and then it was cut short by a sharp, scuttling sound as he rolled off the bed. The impact was hard. He landed on his shell, and for a moment, he felt nothing but a dull, distant pressure, as if his nerves had been wrapped in wool. He lay there, legs still waving, and he listened. He heard the rain start again outside. He heard the clatter of a spoon against a cup in the kitchen. And then he heard his mother's footsteps. They were soft, hesitant. She knocked on his door. "Gregor?" Her voice was a whisper, thin as paper. "It's late. You'll miss the train." He wanted to answer. He wanted to say, "Mother, I'm sorry. I can't. I'm not me anymore, but what came out was a sound so alien, so wrong, that he heard her gasp on the other side of the door. A sharp intake of breath. And then silence. The silence of someone who has heard something they cannot explain. The silence of a mind trying to rearrange reality into something it can understand. That's the moment the horror begins. Not when you see the monster. But when the people you love start to doubt what they hear. The manager from his office arrived. He had to. Gregor had never missed a train. The man's voice was sharp, clipped, full of authority. He stood in the living room, and Gregor could hear him through the thin walls. The manager was angry. He accused Gregor of stealing, of laziness, of being a burden. His father, old and tired, mumbled apologies. His mother, desperate, tried to defend him. And Gregor, pinned to the floor of his bedroom, felt a hot wave of shame that was worse than any pain. He had to explain. He had to show them he was still in there. So he used his new body. He used those strange, fragile legs to push himself upright, to scrape against the door, to turn the lock with his jaw. The key was cold and tasted of brass and rust. It took forever. Each click of the lock was a thunderclap. And when the door swung open, the manager saw him first. His face didn't change. It just went blank. Then the color drained from his skin, leaving it the color of old paper. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth. And he screamed. A high, thin scream that was more animal than human. The manager didn't see a man in a costume. He saw a truth that his mind refused to accept. He saw a beetle the size of a man, with a face that still had Gregor's eyes. And in that moment, the family's world split in two. There was the life before the door opened. And the life after. They locked him in his room. It was the only thing they could do. His father, the old man who had been a failure for years, found a new purpose. He became a jailer. He'd bring Gregor food, bowls of milk and bread, but he'd leave them at the threshold and retreat, his face twisted with disgust. You could hear his breathing, shallow and fast, as he backed away. You could see the tremor in his hands. And Gregor, who had once been the provider, the savior, now had to hide under the sofa when his sister came to clean. His sister, Greta. She was the only one who tried. She'd leave him old, rotting food, vegetables that had gone soft, cheese that had turned green. And Gregor, who had once loved fine meals, would crawl to the bowl and eat with a desperate, animal hunger. He'd press his face into the slime, his antennae twitching, and he'd feel a brief, sickening pleasure. But then he'd look up and see the fear in his sister's eyes. She'd be standing at the door, a rag pressed to her mouth, holding back a sob. She was trying to be brave. But you can't pretend away a monster. And the worst part, the part that gnaws at you in the dark, is that Gregor began to understand her fear. He began to see himself through her eyes. And he felt the same disgust. Weeks passed. Then months. The room grew filthy. Dust clung to his shell. The window was never opened. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of decay and old food. Gregor stopped moving much. He'd lie on the floor, his legs curled beneath him, and he'd listen to the sounds of the family. They had changed. His father had found a job, a menial one, but he walked with a new stiffness, a new pride. His mother sewed lingerie for a shop, her fingers bleeding from the needle. And Greta, his beloved sister, had started working as a salesgirl. They were surviving. They were thriving. Without him. And that's the secret that no one says out loud. The family was better off with Gregor as a monster. He was no longer a burden. He was a reason. A reason to hate. A reason to unite. They would gather in the living room at night, and they would talk about him in whispers, as if he were a ghost. And Gregor, pressed against the cold wood of his door, would listen to their voices, soft and conspiratorial, and he would realize that he was already dead to them. The only question was whether his body would catch up. The end came on a warm evening. The family had rented out a room to 3 boarders, 3 bearded men who ate in silence and demanded order. Gregor, drawn by the smell of food, had crawled out of his room. He didn't mean to. It was instinct. He moved across the living room floor, his shell scraping against the wood, his legs making a dry, rustling sound. The boarders saw him first. They stopped eating. One of them, the youngest, dropped his fork. It clattered against the plate like a gunshot. And then the screaming started. Not from the boarders. From his sister. She let out a wail, a raw, broken sound that filled the room. She pointed at him, her finger trembling, and she screamed, "It has to go." His father, silent and grim, grabbed a broom. He didn't use the bristles. He used the handle. He beat Gregor. He drove him back into his room, pounding the hard shell until it cracked. Gregor felt the pain not in his body, but in his heart. A deep, hollow ache. He crawled to the center of the room, and he lay there. The light from the window faded. The sounds of the family grew quiet. And Gregor Samsa, the traveling salesman who had once been a good son, closed his eyes. He didn't die in a flash of light. He died slowly, like a candle burning out. His legs curled. His antennae drooped. And the last thing he felt was not pain, but relief. A quiet, terrible relief that it was finally over. The next morning, the cleaning woman found him. She poked him with a broom, and when he didn't move, she let out a laugh, a short, sharp sound. "Look at that," she said. "It's dead." The family gathered. They stood in the doorway, and they looked at the dry, hollow shell that had once been their son, their brother. And they smiled. They actually smiled. His father made the sign of the cross, a quick, mechanical gesture. His mother let out a long, shuddering sigh. And Greta, his little sister, stretched her arms and said, with a lightness in her voice, "Finally." They didn't mourn. They celebrated. They took the day off work. They decided to go for a walk in the countryside, the first time they had done so in months. And as they stepped out into the warm sun, they felt the weight lift from their shoulders. They were free. And that's the story. A man wakes up as a bug. His family locks him away. He dies alone. And the world goes on. But here's the question that stays with you, long after the story ends. It's not how did he become an insect. That's the easy question. The hard question is this. Was Gregor Samsa already a monster before he woke up? Or did his family simply find the courage to admit what they had always seen? The sun is shining. The birds are singing. And somewhere, in a small, dusty room, a shell is being swept into the trash. And no one